Hello, my name is Dave Lednicer, and I'm doing the talk on Korean War fighter tactics as part of the Korean War series for Historic Flight Foundation. And because of the health issues in Seattle, we're doing it virtual. So we're recording it, and we'll be posting it on YouTube, as I gather. So anyways, little background first. So in the 5 years from the end of World War II until 1950, when the Korean War started, we went from aircraft with piston engines to commonplace having aircraft with jet engines. There were, of course, some jet engine powered aircraft in World War II, but they weren't predominant. In the Korean War, they were predominant. We also went from straight wing aircraft to swept wing, which made a big difference in drag reduction at high speeds and allowed higher speeds. We also went from manually powered controls like you might find on a Mustang, where everything is powered by push-pull tubes or cables, to hydraulically boosted and then later fully hydraulically powered controls. We also went from unpressurized cockpits like in the Mustang to fully pressurized cockpits on the MiG-15 and the F-86, where the pilots could now fly at much higher altitudes, in fact as high as 51,000 feet with the MiG-15. And we had ejection seats added to the aircraft, so if the aircraft got damaged, the pilot could get out and get away from the aircraft. The F-86 in particular was one of the first fighters with a radar, and it used radar gun sight for ranging for the gun sight. And then lastly, not as obvious, but we switched from tail dragger configurations to tricycle landing gear, which kind of regarded as commonplace now. But actually it was a fairly large change at the time. And of course with jets, trying to do a tail dragger is difficult. The Germans found that out on the Me-262. So jet engine development was huge in what happened right at the end of World War II and up through the beginning of the Korean War. There were several major engines which would be powering the aircraft we'll talk about. The first one was the Rolls-Royce Name, which was developed in 1944. The goal was to produce an engine with 5,000 pounds of thrust. The technology at the time that was well understood was centrifugal compressors. So in a centrifugal compressor, the air is fed into the eye of the compressor and gets thrown outwards and diffused into the combustors, and then after the fuel is burned, it gets fed through the turbine. So the air on a Name is coming in here and here and going in. Because of that configuration, the air doesn't come in straight, it comes into a plenum, and you get some losses in the plenum. So it isn't necessarily the most efficient setup, but that's what worked for them at the time. And of course, this was the configuration that Whittle had started with in the UK, so it's well understood. And of course, Whittle's designs had been taken over by Rolls-Royce. It was built under license by Pratt & Whitney in the United States as the J-42, and it's Pratt up there, and that'll enter into our story. And then 30 were sold to the Soviet Union in 1946. In fact, Stalin was quoted as saying, "What fool will sell us his secrets?" Because it was really a big deal for them to get the jet engines. It gave them a really big boost in technology. So immediately after these 30 engines arrived in the UK, in the USSR, besides also some Derwents that were sold, they were put into production as the RD-45 with about little under 4,900 pounds of thrust, and then later the RD-45 with a little bit more thrust. And we'll see these in the story. Then the Soviets further developed it by improving the metallurgy and whatnot, and ended up at almost 6,000 pounds of thrust. And this shows a British-built Name, but Soviet-built RD-45 was essentially identical. So I think this has L's, maybe not. I thought I saw the letter L for Lucas on the combustors. And that might be the only difference with the Soviet ones. So the other engine that enters into the story is the GE J-47. And once again, it was developed to produce 5,000 pounds of thrust. It was developed from the J-35, which had already been developed by GE. The J-35 had an 11-stage axial compressor. So the air is coming in here, and it goes in a straight line aft to the combustors, and then finally the turbine. This was developed from an 8-stage axial compressor. It was developed by NACA, our National Advisory Council on Aeronautics. And after the J-35 had been developed, the U.S. government asked GE to transfer the design to Allison up there to ease production issues that they had and allow GE to get on with the J-47. And of course, the J-47 had a 12-stage axial compressor to allow it to produce higher thrust. And this is actually a J-47 right here. And you can see one thing with axials is without that monstrous centrifugal compressor, you're able to get a much slimmer engine. and also you can get much higher pressure ratios and better efficiency. So one of the other big things that came in was swept wings. And they had originally been proposed by Adolf Busemann of the AVL in Germany, and he had actually done a paper and presented at the 1935 Volta conference in Italy, which was an international conference, and there were Americans there and Brits and French and everybody else. And the story was that after his presentation, they all got together at dinner and they were joking about it, sketching it on paper, and then everyone promptly forgot about it, except Busemann, of course. And so the paper was overlooked outside Germany, but the Germans continued and did extensive research during the war, and were actually preparing to fly an aircraft to test swept wings. This is the P-1110, which Messerschmitt, 1011, that Messerschmitt was building. Hadn't flown by the end of the war, and it was captured by the Americans, and then a developed version was flown as the Bell X-5 after the war. And this actually had variable sweep, so they could try different sweep angles and measure the effect. Independent of the German work, R.T. Jones at NACA actually came up with the concept in 1945, except his publication of it was actually rejected by NACA. They didn't believe what R.T. had come up with. And they actually forced him to change his publication, where he kind of snuck in the swept wing stuff on the side. But technically, R.T. was right. And then also, it was also developed by this fellow at Sagi in the Soviet Union in 1946, completely independent of the Germans too. But the German wartime data was discovered once the German research facilities had been overrun at the end of World War II. And the data got disseminated to the US, the British, the French, and Soviet technical intelligence. And of course, incorporated into the designs we're about to see. So you look at the German wartime Me-262 fighter and you say, well, swept wing. Well, yes, they swept the wings, but they did it for center of gravity purposes. Because when they switched from having a jet or a piston engine in the nose to just two jets, they had to rebalance the aircraft, and swept wings allowed them to do that. And it only had 18.5 degrees of sweep. As I point out here, later on, they went to 35 degrees on the fighters that we're going to see in Korea, and just by increasing the sweep by 89%, they got a 250% benefit from that. So what happened was, as I say, U.S. technical intelligence passed on the information about the swept wing data to the U.S. manufacturers, including Boeing, and but North American incorporated it into their straight wing design and turned it into what we know as the F-86. And the Soviets similarly passed on the design to MiG, and MiG just started out their design with a 35-degree sweep, resulting in the MiG-15. The Achilles heel of a swept wing aircraft is, as you go up an angle of attack, the first thing that's stalled is now the wingtips. And because the lift then in the center of the wing is still there, it's ahead of the center of gravity, you get a very bad pitch-up tendency. And that was noted and considered very undesirable by pilots. So to fix this, which I call the Achilles heel, on the F-86 they used full-span leading-edge slats. And later on, when that was found to produce too much drag for combat situations, they went to a fixed leading edge and a fence to control the stall. The MiG-15, right off the bat, they just went to a dual wing fence system to control the stall, and that got around those issues. To this day, most swept wing aircraft have one fix or another, whether it be wing pylons for engines or things like that, to control the stall because of this issue. So the F-86 Sabre development went along these lines. This is actually a wind tunnel model of the original concept, which in a lot of ways has a lot of heritage in the P-51 Mustang even. But then, as I say, this 35-degree swept wing technology was brought to the US, and the program was delayed 6 months while it was incorporated. And then the first flight, shown here by Wheaties Welch, one of the pilots who had flown to Pearl Harbor, defending Pearl Harbor, was on October 1st, 1947, which, if you note, is only 13 days before Chuck Yeager broke the speed of sound for the first time at Edwards Air Force Base. And the prototype flew with a J-35 because the J-47 wasn't available yet. Then later on, the first production aircraft flew early the next year, powered by a honest-to-God J-47. And this is the first production aircraft. You might note that the prototype didn't have guns, and the first production item did, but they had doors over the guns, which were later eliminated from the design. About 9,000 F-86s were produced in factories in the US North American, Canada, Canadair, Australia, Commonwealth aircraft, Italy at Fiat, and in Japan, which we had just defeated in World War II, but we wanted to get their aerospace industry going, at Mitsubishi. And this is the development of the F-86. And as I note, the original prototype had slats on the leading edge, and when that was found they produced too much drag, they went to a fixed leading edge with a fence, but the slats were found to be very desirable because this raised the landing speed of the aircraft quite a bit, and especially for the use of the F-86 in less developed countries where the pilots were newbies, they wanted to go back to the slats. And the Canadair Sabre 6, which was effectively an F-86E, did have the slats. And then finally the F-86 F-40, which was developed for export, went to the slats for the wing extension. And really this was regarded as the best wing of all the wings that were on the Sabre. So a few technical details about the F-86. As I noted, it has a radar gun sight with a radar unit up here in the nose. It has an injection seat, pressurized cockpit, and the pilot's wearing a G-suit. So he's able to tolerate much higher G loads in air combat. The G-suit is a device that goes around your lower extremities, squeezes them when you start pulling G, and keeps your blood from flowing down to your legs, and keeps you from losing consciousness, or at least delays it. The F-86 had 435 gallons of internal fuel, which was important, as we'll see. It had hydraulically boosted controls initially, so the hydraulic boost acted in parallel and just made the controls lighter for the pilot. Later on, they went to fully powered controls, and at that point, the hydraulics provided all the force to move the controls, and there was an artificial fuel system for the pilot. And then it could carry 220-gallon drop tanks, which proved to be really important in Korea. And it was armed with 650 caliber machine guns, 3 a side, with about 300 rounds each. And some were fitted with 4 20mm cannon, but they found they had feed problems in combat under G loads. So the 6 machine guns tended to be the standard load. The MiG-15 was on a roughly parallel development path. It started because the Soviets were really worried about B-29 bombers coming in and attacking the Soviet homeland, especially with nuclear weapons. So it was developed as an interceptor, though it was unique and it was an interceptor that proved later on to be just good as a fighter in general. The initial prototype flew just slightly later than the F-86 and literally had one of the Rolls-Royce names as a power plant. I mean, the Soviets didn't even bother to put one of their own in yet because they weren't in production. The competitor was the Lavochkin LA-15 here, which actually proved to be a decent airplane, but it proved to be hard to maintain and to build. So for that reason, the Mikoyan design went out and went into production. So the first production MiG-15 flew at the end of the next year, powered by a Soviet-built name, an RD-45. And in the end, 17,500 MiG-15s were produced in Czechoslovakia by Avia, in Poland by PZL, in China, Shenyang built 2-seat versions, though never the single seat, and then finally in 9 separate factories in the Soviet Union. The Soviets were so desperate to turn out these fighters in bulk that they had 9 factories scattered around the country producing copies of this aircraft that by and large didn't differ much. So details of the MiG-15, like the F-86 has got an ejection seat, pressurized cockpit, but it's only got a simple optical gun sight, no radar ranging, and the pilot does not have a G-suit, which actually proved to be kind of important because it limited the G loads that they could actually pull in combat. It had 372 gallons of fuel, not as much as the Sabre, and could only carry 2 66-gallon fuel tanks, so it was a bit more limited in that regard. It had hydraulically boosted ailerons, but only manual rudder and elevators, which resulted in those controls getting rather heavy at high speeds, which was used against them when that was discovered. But it carried 2 23mm cannons and a 37mm cannon. Now, during World War II, a 37mm cannon was regarded as an anti-tank gun even. So it had very heavy armament. And remember, these are cannons where the shell explodes when it hits. It's not just a solid bullet. So it was very heavily armed. The combat pilots, technically it was the United Nations fighting in Korea because the US got the UN involved soon after the beginning of the war. So we had pilots not only from the US military, but other countries, including South Africa, Australia, Ethiopia, etc. But primarily were U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy pilots, and many had World War II combat experience, including Kabreski, for instance. So this is Joseph McConnell, who had participated in World War II, though not as a pilot, and he ended up being the high-scoring American pilot. This is Jesse Brown, U.S. Navy pilot, who unfortunately got killed during the war, but he represents how the U.S. military had been integrated by Truman in 1948. So African-American pilots were starting to find their way into the ranks. And this is a Soviet frontal aviation pilot who was the high-scoring pilot for the Soviets. So despite the official denials, we actually were fighting the Soviets. This wasn't officially acknowledged until the early 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but that's actually who was providing most of the air power in Korea. And then, of course, the Chinese were also involved, and this is the high-scoring pilot from the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force. And then lastly, there were North Korean pilots. This is a North Korean pilot who defected to the south after the end of the war, showing the typical pilot gear of a leather flying helmet. And he ended up becoming a U.S. citizen and actually working in the aerospace industry in the United States. And I think he's still alive in the U.S. even. So we're going to be comparing the aircraft using energy maneuverability theory. And this is a means of quantifying and comparing aircraft maneuvering performance. It was developed by U.S. Air Force Colonel John Boyd and Thomas Christie, a civil employee of the Air Force. And it basically breaks down the aircraft maneuvering. We plot it, this is turn rate, so how many degrees a second the aircraft can turn against Mach number. And these are lines right here of constant turn radius, going from very small to very large turning radius. And then across this way, we have lines of constant G's. So at a given, let's say Mach 0.5, to pull a turn of about 6,500 feet radius, the pilot has to pull about 1.5 G's. So it's a real good way of looking at that. This line is the sustained performance of the aircraft. So in other words, anywhere within this envelope, a pilot could fly at those conditions until his fuel ran out, basically, all day long. So Mach 0.7, the pilot could go 1.5 G's and continue to turn at that rate literally all day. Out at this line is instantaneous. So in other words, the pilot can pull higher G's, but then he's losing energy, and to regain it, he usually has to descend, which is the typical way of regaining your energy. And you can see in this case, they can pull all the way out to 4 G's here. And then this is the max level speed of the aircraft, and then this is the max speed limit of the aircraft. So in other words, you can dive out to Mach 0.92 in this aircraft. So this is the way we'll be looking at them, and we'll be overlaying aircraft to compare them. And these are some of the air combat maneuvers. And the thing you can see in common between them is they're mostly turning, and a lot of it's in the horizontal plane, but for instance in the high yo-yo, the pilot might be climbing and then descending, trading kinetic energy for potential and back to kinetic here. Another, of course, one is the rolling scissors, where the aircraft slow down and try to get on each other's tail. And then you have low yo-yo and lag roll, once again, which are very similar sorts of maneuvers. So in each of these cases, you're trying to maintain energy, and if you lose energy, try to regain energy. So what the plots show for a comparison. Here we're going to look at a F-80 Shooting Star against the MiG-15. And first thing we see is that the MiG-15 has slightly more instantaneous maneuvering capability through this range than the F-80. The F-80's got a tiny bit more here, and they're about equal right there. Then if you look at sustained, the F-80 has more sustained maneuvering capability out to Mach 0.75, and the MiG-15, though, out beyond 7.5 has a clear advantage. In fact, the F-80 can't even go this fast. So the MiG can maneuver around it at the higher speeds, pulling as much as 2 G's even. So the MiG, as long as he can keep the combat at higher speeds, he has a definite advantage. These days, a lot of work in air combat has taken a step beyond energy maneuverability into agility. And this is an example of a master's thesis that was published at MIT back in 1990. And you can see it's our own Vera Martinovich, who of course flies the DC-3 and the B-25 for us, and this is her master's thesis. So anyways, the Korean War. This was the Korean Peninsula. At the end of World War II, the Soviet forces invaded from the north, the American forces invaded from the south, because this had been a Japanese colony since roughly the turn of the century. And the Soviets established a state in the north, the DPRK, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And the Americans and their allies established in the south the Republic of Korea. And so this was the status quo, and the leader of the north really wanted to reunify the country under his command, and because of that launched an invasion. And in June 1950. And the invasion actually proceeded to get down to a front about right here. It's called so-called Pusan Perimeter. At that point, the Americans got heavily involved, and General MacArthur made an amphibious landing in Incheon in the back of the North Koreans, cut their supply lines, and basically there was a total reversal, and the front ended up right up here by the Chinese border. And then the Chinese felt threatened, so they introduced, quote, volunteer forces, and they invaded and basically pushed the front line right back to the demarcation line, which we'll see at the end is where the war ended. So the timeline is broken into two parts. The first part was from the original invasion in June 1950 up to Halloween 1950, and the DPRK was the major air force involved, in fact the only, and they were flying Soviet aircraft, Yak-3, Yak-7, Lavochkin-7, and IL-10 ground attack aircraft. The Republic of Korea mainly had T-6s and other light aircraft, and then the UN quickly intervened after the invasion, and the British provided Sea-Furies, Sea-Fires, the Americans, Mustangs, twin Mustangs, Shooting Stars, Thunderjets, Panthers, Corsairs, B-26 Invaders, and lastly, B-29s, as Mike Lombardi has talked about in the previous talk. And very quickly, the DPRK Air Force was utterly destroyed. So at this point, Stalin introduced his forces on November 1st, 1950, and under cover of, quote, Soviet volunteers flying for the North Koreans, the Soviet Frontal Aviation Forces, and also later on the People's Republic of China, People's Liberation Army Air Forces flying MiG-15s, and the DPRK Air Force was rebuilt with MiG-15s. The UN forces continued to build, and we introduced Meteor F-8s flown by the Australians because they couldn't get F-86s. British Fireflies off aircraft carriers, American AD Sky Raiders, Tiger Cats, Starfires, Sky Knights, and then lastly, most importantly, F-86s, Sabres. And the Republic of Korea Air Force was also rebuilt as a ground attack unit with Mustangs. But these are the two primary antagonists that fought during the Korean War. So here are the strategies. The UN ground forces had attack aircraft and bombers that were devastating the North Korean countryside and forces and economy. So the MiG-15s took off from bases in China, right across the Yalu River, and came in at high altitude, attempting to penetrate, intercept the bombers and ground attack aircraft. In return, the U.S. Air Force, primarily F-86s, at 45,000 feet, slightly lower because they couldn't go higher, attempted to block the MiG-15s once they crossed the Yalu. But the American forces weren't allowed north of the Yalu into Chinese territory, though they did kind of in a covert way at times. But by and large, they tried to block at the Yalu River. So as a result, this is the Yalu River right here. These are the bases the Soviets operated out of. MiG Alley was here, which is where the air combat largely took place. And the F-86s flew out of bases down here, used their drop tanks and fuel to get up here. There was air combat, and of course had to recover back here. If an aircraft suffered damage, the pilot could go out to like Chodo Island and whatnot and eject, and also over the Japan Sea and be picked up by helicopter. In fact, McConnell actually, at one point, his aircraft was damaged, and he ejected and was rescued from the ocean. So this is the first comparison. This is P-51 Mustang, which encountered the MiG-15s very early in the war. And the thing you can see is the MiG-15's got a great advantage in sustained performance, except at low speeds. So by and large, if the MiG pilot could keep the combat at higher speeds, the Mustang was dominated completely by the MiGs. Though they did have very similar max G loadings that the pilots could pull. But in the instantaneous, once again, the P-51 had it slow, an advantage there, while the MiG-15 had it out faster. So the P-51 was, or F-51, wasn't really a big contender. And I got to remember to keep using F, because at this point, the old U.S. Army Air Force had been turned into the U.S. Air Force, which was a separate force, and they got rid of the P for pursuit and turned it to the F for fighter. So the British had Sea Furies operating off aircraft carriers and in combat, and they did meet MiGs in combat. And once again, the story as much as with the Mustang. If the Sea Fury pilot could somehow slow down the combat or somehow surprise the MiG pilot, he had an advantage, but otherwise the MiG had a great advantage. So for that reason, the Sea Fury didn't work too well either in combat. The Australians couldn't get F-86s, so they introduced Meteors in the combat. This is a first generation jet fighter from World War II, less capable airplane. And once again, less capable. You can see as far as sustained performance, it pretty well matches the MiG-15, except if speed falls off, and then the MiG-15 has an advantage of it can keep the combat at higher speeds. In instantaneous performance, there's some advantage here, but you wouldn't want to fly here. Otherwise, the MiG has it. There were some MiGs actually shot down by Meteors where they could surprise them, but by and large, the Meteors suffered at the hands of the MiGs. So the U.S. started out the war with shooting stars, F-80s. Once again, first generation American jets. And this story is actually much like the piston engine aircraft, where the F-80 had an advantage at lower speeds in terms of sustained performance. At instantaneous, it didn't do as well. The MiG had an advantage pretty much no matter what. And then of course, out here, the MiG could go to higher speeds and also continue to pull G out here. So if they could keep the combat moving at higher speeds, they had a definite advantage. So for that reason, after the initial encounters between MiGs and F-80s, the F-80s were withdrawn from air combat duties and used for ground attack. So then the other aircraft that was in theater as a first generation aircraft was the F-84. And here you can see a case where the MiG just totally outclasses it. The MiG has much better sustained performance, much better instantaneous performance. And once this was realized, the F-84s were relegated to ground attack duties, and Sabres were used to protect them and keep the MiGs away from them. This data, by the way, these charts are all developed from actual aerodynamic data for these aircraft that I was able to locate. So this is for real as to how it was. I actually found NACA data for the F-84, and the MiG data is all from the flight manual, where they actually give you a lot of this stuff. So Grumman Panthers operating off American carriers, including like Neil Armstrong flying one, did encounter MiGs. As you can see, the F-9F does have an advantage once again at the lower speeds in sustained performance, but not instantaneous. So the MiG could pretty much hold sway over the aircraft. And the other thing is the Panther actually had rather restrictive G limits that varied in a strange way. And that's right out of the flight manual. So the F-9F, there was one pilot that did prevail over the MiGs. He surprised them and managed to fight them and down a couple. But other than that, the MiGs held sway over them too. So the U.S. introduced F-86 Sabres when it became clear that a better fighter was needed to deal with the MiGs. And the F-86 actually was pretty successful against the MiGs. As you can see, they're pretty closely matched in terms of sustained performance. The MiG's got a slight advantage here. The F-86 has it out here to a degree. And as far as instantaneous, the F-86 by and large was better than the MiG in that region. But remember, you can't use instantaneous except for quite literally on an instant, and then you're losing energy. So they're very closely matched aircraft. So the U.S. took a step further and we added more thrust to the F-86. And we also switched from an elevator on the tail to an all-flying tail to gain maneuverability. And once again, the two aircraft are pretty evenly matched. There was some agility gained with this, which isn't really considered here. But other than that, the conclusion is, once again, a lot of it boiled down to pilot abilities as to who came out ahead in combat. Then lastly, we developed the F-86F-20, with more thrust, and we raised the speed limit on the airplane out to Mach 1.4. So the pilots could actually dive out to supersonic speeds. So because of this, while they were pretty evenly matched through sustained performance, all of a sudden the F-86 pilots could dive and have a big advantage out here. And that really did work to their favor. In addition, as you can see, they were qualified to pull 7 Gs, and with G suits could, while the MiGs were limited down here to 4 Gs, and of course without G suits, the pilots really wouldn't want to do that very much. So the lack of G suits in the MiGs really handicapped them. Then we went to reduce drag. We went to a fixed leading edge on the F-86 F-25, which had the famous 6.3 wing. And you can see that much like E model, they're pretty evenly matched in this region, but of course, huge advantage out here. And because of the reduced drag, it has slightly higher speeds. And of course, the aircraft actually did very well in air combat. And then finally, that was kind of the ultimate F-86. Let's look at outcomes. If you look, there were 78 F-86s lost in air combat. The Soviets have admitted they lost 335 MiGs in air combat. So right away, you can see that there was a massive US advantage in terms of air combat. And a lot of this was due to the experience of the pilots and the capabilities of the aircraft. We also lost 17 B-29s, mostly because the MiGs were able to get through the F-86 screens and down them. So they switched to nighttime bombing because of that. And then you can see there's a variety of ground combat aircraft that were down when the MiGs managed to make it through the barrier, the F-86 barriers. In addition, the South African Air Force lost a Mustang, and the Royal Australian Air Force lost 5 Meteors. And then, of course, the Republic of Korea Air Force lost 135 mostly ground attack aircraft. Besides the Soviet losses, it's estimated that the People's Republic of China lost about 379 aircraft, including 224 MiGs, and the DPRK lost 750 aircraft between the initial period and the later period combined, which is probably about 100 MiG-15. So if you add these 3 numbers up, you can see the Sabres came out far ahead in terms of kill ratios. So, in conclusion, an armistice was signed in July 1953 after Eisenhower had been elected on the promise of ending the war. Peace treaty was never signed. Instead, it was just an armistice to stop the fighting. And occasionally it still flares up, but technically the war never ended. So it continues to be one of the most heavily fortified areas, the demilitarized zone running across Korea. So in the country, of course, is still divided in the Republic of Korea and the DPRK. In the 1950s and 60s, they had economies of roughly the same size. But at this point, the Republic of Korea has one of the world's largest economies. I think it's like number 7 or something in the world, despite the smaller population compared to other countries. But the DPRK is also one of the poorest countries in the world. So, further developments after the Korean War, these aircraft we were just talking about, what they led to. So, right after the war, there was a lot of emphasis on radar-guided missiles. In the US, the AIM-7 Sparrow was developed. In France, the R-530, and the Soviet Union, there were 2 missiles developed. But in the United States, there was also development work on infrared-guided missiles. Hughes developed the AIM-4 Falcon, and the AIM-9 Sidewinder was kind of developed on the sly at China Lake by some really entrepreneurial folks there. And then the Sidewinder was actually used on F-86s. So here it is on a nationalist Chinese F-86 that took part in the air combat over the Straits of Formosa. And one of these aircraft in the late 50s fired a missile at a Chinese MiG-15. The missile lodged in the MiG-15 but didn't explode. And the MiG-15 flew back to base. They pulled the missile out. They realized the treasure they had. They sent it to the Soviet Union. And the Soviets copied it as the K-13 atoll, to the point where the Israelis discovered they could actually take an atoll and put it on a Sidewinder rail, electronics matched, and they could actually use it in combat, which they did. Suffered from not having as great a reliability, but otherwise it was still a good missile. And of course it was used heavily in the Vietnam War by the North Vietnamese. But the advent of these radar-guided missiles led to less emphasis on air combat maneuvering and guns and cannon, because they figured that most of what's going to happen is they're going to have to shoot down bombers coming to bomb their cities. Instead, in the Vietnam War, the US really suffered for that philosophy, and we had to put an increased emphasis on air combat maneuvering and on putting guns back in the fighters. And the result, we developed the F-15, F-16, and F-18, where the emphasis was on air combat maneuvering now and with installed cannons. This is an F-16 firing a Sidewinder, and this aircraft, of course, has been used in air combat by the Israelis and the Americans. Not a single one has been lost in air combat, and of course they've scored many kills. But this is part of the reason why, and part of the way to illustrate the development work that was done. This is an energy maneuvering capability chart for the F-86 versus the F-16. And you can see right away in sustained maneuvering, the F-16 has a massive advantage. It can pull, pilot of the F-16 can pull substantial Gs out to very high speeds and basically maneuver around the Sabre all day long. And when it comes to instantaneous maneuvering, the Sabre is good out to here, and the F-16 can pull more Gs at pretty much any speed and way out here at high speed. So the F-16 is a very significant development as an air-to-air combat aircraft. Where to see them locally? Canadair actually built Sabres up in Montreal, and actually, I'm sorry, in Toronto. Wait, Canadair? No, Montreal, I'm sorry. And they actually built the Sabre 5, which did not have a US equivalent, but Boeing bought one, used it as a chase plane for many years, and it's now displayed at the Museum of Flight in its original RCAF markings. The Flying Heritage and Combat Armor Museum owns an F-86A. This is a photo of it, but I don't know where it is. It's not on display. Hopefully it's being restored at this point. And then lastly, when the Museum of Flight bought the Champlin collection out of Arizona, MiG-15 BIS came with it, and you see it here at the Museum of Flight, painted in Chinese markings, and it's now on display in the Great Hall. So, a real quick quiz at the end of things here. So this is an F-86 in flight, but what model is it? There's some interesting little tidbits here. So the fairing back here by the tail is that of an F-86A, because there was not hydraulically powered controls to be faired over. The later ones had a fairing back here that's not there, so it's an A model back there. The windshield is V-shaped instead of flat glass, like on the later models, so that makes it an A or an early model F-86E. It's got 6 guns in the nose without doors, so that means it could be an A, an E, or an F. But it's got the 6.3 leading edge without slats in the fence, which makes it either an F-86E or F. So what is it? Well, according to the registers, it's an F-86A that the hard leading edge was retrofitted to, which this might be unique. It might be the only one like this. So anyways, that's my talk on the Korean War fighter tactics. I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for more. Take care. Thank you. Bye.